A very warm welcome to this Paul Hamlyn Foundation Education Policy Institute webinar on the impact of the Nationality and Borders Act on the educational outcomes of refugee and migrant pupils. I'm David Laws, I'm the chair of the Education Policy Institute, and I'll be chairing our discussion today. And I'd just like to underline as we start our thanks to the Paul Hamlyn Foundation for supporting not just this event, but an earlier roundtable that we had with a number of policy experts and practitioners in this area that was an extremely useful background and set up for the webinar here today. As most of you will know, there have been concerns about the Nationality and Borders Act and worries that that will undermine further the access and outcomes for refugee and migrant pupils. And today we want to look at some of the risks around that. We want to look at the possible policy solutions, and we also want to look at the practical, in some cases, school and college level solutions that may help to address some of these concerns. We are dividing the time that we've got today into two parts, really, two or three parts. The first is an address by Catherine Gladwell, the Chief Executive of the Refugee Education UK. We're delighted to have Catherine here with us today, and she's going to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes at the beginning of the proceedings. Then we're going to have a brief overview, which may help the discussion, from Jo Hutchinson, who is our Director of SEND and Additional Need at the Education Policy Institute, and who was the author of a report on the outcomes for refugee and asylum seeking children in England that was published about a year ago, and gives us some fascinating background about the nature of the challenges that we face in this area. And then we have a panel session where we have 4 panelists who are going to be making their comments on some of the big issues in the debate. And after the panel have spoken on 2 sort of sub-debates, we'll then give an opportunity for all of you who are listening in to make comments on what you've heard, and also to ask questions of the panelists, who I will come back to put those questions to. We've allowed about 90 minutes for this, which is a good stint for an online event. Usually people begin to run out of steam after 90 minutes, and also a couple of our panelists are going to need to go to other events that they have commitments on at 4:30. So I'm not going to allow things to run on beyond that time. Usually in these occasions, things tend to run slightly behind schedule early on in the proceedings as the debate really gets going, but then speeds up a bit towards the end, which is what I'm hoping as chair. So thanks to the panelists for being here today. I'll introduce the panelists when we come to the panel session. Thanks to all of you for listening in. And Catherine, over to you to give the keynote opening address. And thank you again so much for being here with us today. Catherine.
Thank you so much. It's really an honour to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and learning from my fellow panelists, and also from the contributions from those who are listening as well. As we know, the Nationality and Borders Act came into force in June last year, and it will have a concrete impact on people seeking asylum in the UK. The UN Refugee Agency has publicly said that some of the provisions in the Act are in breach of the Refugee Convention, and they've expressed particular concern about the powers of the Act that seek to prevent people from applying for asylum, move responsibility for refugee protection to other states, and criminalise new arrivals. And in referring to one of the key features of the Act, which I'll come back to in a minute, the splitting of refugees into 2 groups based on their means of arrival to the UK, Felipe Grande, who is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, said that it is disappointing that the UK would choose a course of action aimed at deterring the seeking of asylum and relegating most refugees, i.e. those in group 2 of those two groups, to a lesser status with fewer rights and a constant threat of removal. So this is the context that we're talking about today. But what does it all mean for education broadly and learning outcomes for refugee children in particular? And honestly, the truth is that there is still a lot of uncertainty about this, and the full impact of the Act trickling down is still somewhat unclear for education. What is clear, however, is that the Act has come into force in an educational context that is already immensely challenging, as I'm sure all of our other panelists will allude to as well, both for refugee and asylum seeking children and for those who teach them. So I'm going to use my opening few minutes to outline just 3 overarching challenges that we're already seeing at Refugee Education UK in our practical and research work across the breadth of the education system, and 2 key ways in which we anticipate the Act exacerbating these existing challenges. I'll then try to offer up a few kind of principles of emerging good practice that we believe will stand education institutions and policymakers in good or at least better stead as the impact of the Act begins to be felt. And share a few questions that we might want to kind of explore together as we continue our conversations this afternoon. So the current challenges, the context that the Act is coming into. We at RE UK work with about 300 education institutions each year, and we also provide direct education support to around about 700 young refugees through our own education support programmes. So drawing on this work and on our research, I want to outline just 3, there could be many more, but just 3 current issues that impact outcomes specifically. So firstly, the wait for school places and the reluctance to admit older new arrivals. So research that we carried out for UNICEF UK a couple of years ago showed that refugee children already wait up to 9 months to get a place in school, and that the delays are worst at the upper secondary level. And then this is exacerbated by a fear amongst school leaders that admitting children just before key exams, most often GCSEs, will jeopardise their results profiles. Now, we know that this doesn't have to be the case, and that there are provisions that allow schools not to include these stats in their published results. Nonetheless, even today, this fear still remains, and it's already very difficult, we find, to secure school places for children arriving aged 15 or 16. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the lack of English as an additional language and mental health support in schools. Research and practice both consistently find that these are the 2 biggest barriers to refugee children achieving the learning outcomes that they otherwise could. And yet, even in schools with large populations of children seeking sanctuary, we see that they often struggle, often for no fault of their own, to provide sufficient support in either of these 2 categories. Then thirdly, we also know, not just in the UK, but globally, that barriers to education for refugee children accumulate as they move through the education system, till only 6% of refugees globally are able to access university. The UK education system is not immune to this. I think our education progression team at RE UK is probably in one of its busiest seasons to date at the moment. So the wait for school places and the reluctance to admit older new arrivals, the lack of English as an additional language and mental health support in schools, at least not a sufficient amount of it, and then thirdly, the accumulating barriers to progression as children move up through the education system. That's the current context that we're all working in. So what do we foresee the impact of the Act to be on all of this? I want to say just 2 things. The first is that as we think about this existing issue of waiting for school places and the particular challenges for older children, we have to consider the changes to age assessments that the Act is bringing in. So for those who aren't aware, many children seeking sanctuary in the UK are put through a process where the local authority decides if they will accept that the child is the age that they claim to be. Now, the Act has introduced an age panel, and so disputes will no longer be dealt with at the local authority level. And whilst as with many aspects of the Act, it's not fully clear yet how this will work. We and many others anticipate that there will be significant delays and many teething issues. And we already know that going through protracted and drawn out age assessments and or being wrongly age assessed is already a key contributing factor to keeping children out of the most appropriate level of education for them. So that's the first implication of the Act that we see on the horizon. The second is that we also anticipate that this kind of two-tier concept, which is at the heart of the Act, of dividing refugees into Group 1 and Group 2, will have a negative impact. And as well as kind of clearly bigger picture, playing into some of the unhelpful narratives around like good migrant and bad migrants, we do think that this will also concretely affect learning outcomes for refugee children and their educational progression. Why? Well, if families are granted Tier 2 status, then they will be in a much slower and more insecure route to eventual settlement. And being in immigration limbo has been shown again and again to be linked to poorer mental health and well-being outcomes, which in turn are well documented to negatively impact learning outcomes for children. It's also often linked to reduced eligibility to further and higher education, both in terms of fee status and access to loans and bursaries. So they're the two kind of key initial things that we see on the horizon. And I realized that all of this paints a rather bleak picture, both of what we're dealing with already and of how things could potentially deteriorate further. So I want to close by offering up a few principles of good practice, practical things that schools can be considering doing now to stand them in good stead for whatever is to come. And the majority of these have links into policy frameworks and policy provision as well. So firstly, we need to make sure that there are good processes in place, better processes in place for admitting mid-year arrivals and older children, particularly those at the upper secondary level. Secondly, we need to make an environment where schools can do more to bolster their English as an additional language and mental health provision for refugee and asylum seeking children. Thirdly, we need to enable schools, and particularly those who are designing curriculum, to explore more what it might look like to consider adapted curricula. So using elements of accelerated learning programs, for example, to help children who've missed out on education catch up. And there's some really interesting pockets of good practice springing up around this that I think can be teased out to create some more interesting policy frameworks as well. And lastly, invest in training for staff, and I'm sure Lisa Maria will speak more about this as well. But again, REUK, the Chartered College of Teachers and Nottingham University have been working together on a number of teacher training initiatives that we can all speak about more as we go through the course of the afternoon. And I'm sure that all of the speakers that we've got today will take some of these points further. So finally, as we continue our conversation this afternoon, and in light of this very kind of broad brushstrokes overview of both the status quo and what may be to come that I've been able to paint, I'd like to pose two questions that I don't think any of us on our own yet have the answers to, but perhaps we can consider as we talk further. So I think in order to really address this issue of learning outcomes for refugee children in the context of the Act that is trickling down, I think we need to consider again how our education institutions can both be places of sanctuary and welcome and focus on academic outcomes for refugee learners. So we see a lot of wonderful work around the former and less focus around the latter. And that's something that we'd like to see developed over the next few years and see these two threads brought together more as a matter of course. Secondly, I think we need to explore how we flip the narrative on migrant children being a burden on the education system, which we still are kind of is put to us on an almost daily basis as we engage with people around the country, and take a much more asset-based approach. And I want to share the words of one of the head teachers that we've worked with, the head of an inner city London boys comprehensive, who has enrolled over the last few years. I think at present they have 70-something refugee and asylum seeking students in their cohort. And he said, enrolling refugee and asylum seeking students into my school is the one most positive thing that I have done in terms of both increasing aspirations and improving behaviour across the entire student body. The more we can adopt that type of mindset, I think the more we will be creating environments where all children can thrive. The Act itself is sadly not encouraging an environment where refugee and asylum seeking children will be most likely to thrive and flourish, or in our opinion, where their resilience and contributions are most celebrated and valued. But education institutions can and often do this to brilliant effect. And that, I think, is what I would like us to be holding on to at this time as we look at these questions together. So thank you for giving me these a few minutes to speak. And it's really a joy to be here with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you so much for that. You were very disciplined over timing and you set us all a good example. But you also covered a tremendous amount of territory and in a razor sharp and very, very clear way. So you've set up the rest of the debate and discussion extremely well. So thank you very much for that. If there are questions on any of the things that Catherine has mentioned, then there'll be a full opportunity to put those questions and comments in the 2 discussion sessions that are coming up. But before we go to that panel discussion, I'm going to bring in Jo Hutchinson, as I promised to, just to talk a little bit about an overview of the piece of work that she published a year ago. Jo.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be as brief as I can to save time for the panel discussion, but I just want to give you a very quick outline of our contribution to research on this topic, which was where we were set the challenge of could we do anything to actually find out about the outcomes in a quantitative data analysis sense of refugee and asylum seeking children in schools in England. This is challenging because there are no data flags that identify children who are in schools in England as being refugee and asylum seekers. So we had to find a way around this, and we set about combining lots of different sources of data in order to arrive at a best estimate of which pupil records are the ones most likely to be refugee and asylum seeking children. So this involved factors such as children having arrived after reception for the first time in a school in England, speaking English as an additional language, the particular first language they speak, and whether that's associated with countries where we typically have refugee and asylum seeking people arriving from, and also local authority level statistics from the Home Office on where families with children claiming asylum support are located within the country. So we bundled all this data together and used it to sort of estimate a probability for each child's record of which of those that are most likely to be refugee and asylum seekers. And the findings that we found from having gone through that process were that for the asylum seeker and resettled refugee group, we estimated a 17-month GCSE attainment gap. So that's similar in size to disadvantaged children. And so it's obviously a great concern that we're seeing those children who make it into a school are sitting their GCSEs, that their GCSE grades in English and maths are behind those of other children. We also compared the records of children who are unaccompanied asylum seeking children and found there a 34-month attainment gap at GCSE. So that's similar to children who have an education, health and care plan because they have special educational needs, just to give you a sort of benchmark for where that sits in the distribution of pupils in schools. And we also found that those unaccompanied asylum seeking children had slightly raised absence and fixed period exclusion rates. So a few concerns there around the outcomes of refugee and asylum seeking children that we were able to find through our research. We are hoping to be able to take this research forward and continue to look at further outcomes for these groups of children. Thank you.
Joe, that was great. Thank you very much indeed for that overview. So we're now going to come to the panel sessions. You'll have seen that we had 5 panelists lined up to talk. Unfortunately, one of those prospective panelists, Anjali, has had to tell us that she's not very well today and can't attend the panels. So we will miss her, but obviously quite understand. But we have, in any case, 4 other outstanding speakers who are going to give their response to the challenges that we've identified for the panel discussion, and then listen in to your comments and respond to any of your questions. I'll just briefly introduce the 4 panelists, and then I'll come to each in turn for their comments. So we have Kimberly Garand, the Youth Development Lead for We Belong. Catherine, obviously, I've already introduced and you've heard from. We have Baroness Ruth Lister, who is obviously a member of the House of Lords, but also is active in a number of other organisations and has a long-term interest in this area. We have Lisa Maria Muller, the Head of Research for the Chartered College of Teaching, as our 4th panellist. And later on in the session, at the very end, I'll ask Joe Hutchinson for some final reflections on the debate that we have. So we're going to come first to the issue of navigating the system to access education. And the key question here is, how can we develop education policy to meet the needs of refugee and asylum-seeking children? Now, we are looking at this in the context of the Act, as Catherine has already described, but we're also doing so in the context of being quite a long way through this Parliament and looking to a general election, which is likely at some stage next year. So I think that panelists can answer this question however they like. They can view it in terms of the context of existing government legislation, or also talk about what a better or different policy might be under a different government. So, Kimberly, I'm going to come to you first for your comments on this issue, 3 to 5 minutes, and then I will go to Ruth, Lisa Maria, and then Catherine. Kimberly, over to you.
David. So just to give everybody a bit of context as to what We Belong actually does, we do work with refugees and asylum seekers because we support young people with mixed statuses. However, the predominant group that we work with, or in terms of our client base, it's those with limited leave to remain on private life grounds. So it's typically that if somebody has applied for asylum and their decision has been changed by the Home Office to award them status, they will end up on a limited leave to remain route or be recognised officially as a refugee. So that's where our space kind of fits in. And when I was thinking about this question, I think the biggest thing is that the problem at the moment with education policy is that it focuses sometimes on very niche pockets of migrants, and then it almost then separates different migrant groups in the same way that the Act that we're discussing does. And we've often found this at We Belong, that, you know, there are refugees, there are asylum seekers, there are those with limited leave to remain. However, the young people aren't always, they don't always fully put themselves in those categories in the first place, but policy doesn't always recognise that these different groups have different needs. And so I think there needs to be changes to, I guess, policymakers as well as us as practitioners, recognising that there are differences in these particular statuses, but in terms of the needs and how they should be met, they're also different. So just to give you an example, a lot of the schools that we work with who have asylum seekers in their schools, sometimes they don't always differentiate between the needs of newly arrived asylum seekers and asylum seekers who are already in the UK. And that's what I mean by that. So it's recognising the ways in which the current policies impacting young refugees and asylum seekers and those with limited leave to remain that are already here, and what are we seeing from that, and then thinking about how we collect data to do a constant review to then feed to policymakers to recommend changes. I find in this sector we have a lot of anecdotes and a lot of case issues that different organizations work on, but there just isn't enough data per se that we can actually bring forward to policymakers to say, this is the problem, this is the scale. I do know that in 2019, I think it was the University of Wolverhampton who did a study as part of the GLA, and they found that there was over 300,000 young people, children and young people in the UK that had precarious status. So it was all of those mixed statuses that I mentioned. I think we need more recent figures in order to think about this and tackle this issue. And also just to ensure, I think that in terms of education providers, they work closely with us as practitioners in the sector. And then in terms of outlining the actual needs that the young people need, it needs to be more specific. So like I mentioned earlier, that those different groups, by sectioning them and seeing, okay, if these are newly arrivals, could it be that we need, I don't know, better induction policies? How can we implement these? If these are young people on limited leave to remain, what are the reasons that school trips are being missed or there's lateness? Could there be wider issues? So I think education providers can only understand the wider context of that with the support of practitioners who work in the third sector like we do.
Kimberly, that's great. Thank you very much for those thoughts. I should say, by the way, that after our 4 panelists have spoken, we will take any questions or comments that people want to make. So do put those in the chat as they come up now, including anything that you wanted to pick up from Catherine's opening comments. But Ruth, I'm going to come to you next. I know that you've had a few problems with your Zoom and you've warned us not to worry if you go on and off our screens, but welcome and thank you for taking part.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Catherine, both for a really helpful sort of keynote, but also for the work that you do, because Heather Starr from RAMP, who gives me some support on asylum issues, it was clear from the work she did helping prepare for this session that all roads, either directly or indirectly, lead to your organisation on the question of the education of refugee and asylum seekers. So I think you're doing an amazing job. But I think that fact was reflected in our deliberations in the House of Lords and probably in the Commons as well on the Nationality and Borders Bill, because I don't recall anybody raising the question of the implications of the bill for the education of refugees and asylum seekers. And certainly none of the briefings that I received from the sort of mainstream refugee organisations. Some of us did talk quite a bit about children, especially age assessment, which Catherine mentioned. But given the importance of education to children's integration, belonging, security and general well-being, I do wonder if one question for us to consider is how to integrate the issues of education more into the general work around child refugees and asylum seekers. And I should say, I'm really here to learn. I'm not an expert on this at all. So please bear that in mind. As Catherine said, we don't yet know the impact of the Nationality and Borders Act, but it's likely to be, as she said, very harmful. Second-class refugee status, as you mentioned, which will provide only temporary protection and very few rights. And how many will be affected by it, I don't know, because next week we're having what sounds like an even worse bill being published, which will try and get rid of people like instantly. Anyone coming over without permission will be sent somewhere. So that is very worrying. But anyway, what we have to deal with so far, it seems to me that for those who get the second tier of refugee status, I mean, it's an inherently insecure position. And I'm not an educationalist, but I think from what I read that, to benefit fully from education, you need an element of security in your life. So it's going to be very difficult for young students, children. And there's increased likelihood of destitution, fears of the sector that more families will be subject to the no recourse to public funds rule. And I just wanted to read here, this is about family separation. It's a House of Lords report that came out this week. And although it's a different category, it seems to me that some of what it says is actually very relevant to what we're talking about today. And it says, Raquel de Guessio told us that the impact of family separation was most tangible when considering the performance of children at school. She mentioned studies according to which separation from a parent decreases the level of motivation, autonomy, and even manual dexterity of a child. In extreme cases, she told us young children can develop mutism, stool holding, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. When both parents are present to raise a child, but one of the parents has no recourse to public funds, we also heard that this child is less likely to perform at school, as well as their peers, because they have worse circumstances in which to study and no spare money for out-of-school activities. And in the specific case of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children and young people, Dr. Helen Connolly, Senior Lecturer of University of Bedfordshire, told us their ability to fully enjoy school and achieve their full potential is absolutely hindered, often because they are anxious about the situation of their family. And we met a young person who'd been in this situation who told us, I was studying, but I could not focus on my studies. So it seems to me that the whole atmosphere that's going to be created by this legislation is likely to exacerbate that kind of barrier to education. And as was mentioned, age assessment is going to change. There are fears it will increase the likelihood of wrongful assessment as an adult. And it could even mean notices of intent to be removed to Rwanda. And again, implications for insecurity, mental health, which feed into education. Now, in terms of, we've heard about some of the existing barriers. I was quite shocked when the difficulties of getting a place that young children could be waiting for as long as 9 months. I mean, it's just dreadful, because how much has their education already been disrupted through the time they've spent getting into the UK from wherever it is they've come from. What it means if they're moved from one local authority to another, what it means if they're living in a hotel. None of that is conducive to, even if they can get access to education. And then, as you talked about, the language issues, which, as I understand it, then restrict access to the curriculum that's available, and dealing with trauma. I mean, you talked about mental health support. And the fact is that many of these children are highly traumatized, and yet people working in the schools that they're going to may well not have the training, and we heard about training from Kimberly as well, necessary to deal with that kind of trauma. But like you, I want to end sort of on the sort of more optimistic note, because there are, I think, beacons of hope. The schools, universities of sanctuary, although I take your point about needing to focus on academic achievement as well as providing support. And then here in Nottingham, which is where I am, there's something called the NEST project, which provides full, for older children and young people, provides full curriculum based on the principles of safety, belonging, and success. And the people, there are, I think, in the audience, 2 people, Ruth Brittle and Joanna McIntyre, who know much more about it because they're involved in it. I'm hoping that they will tell us something about it in the chat, because I think it's projects like that. I think we need to learn from those beacons of hope, and both how they develop curriculum, practical support, and an inclusive culture. And I'll leave it at that.
Ruth, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks for underlining the point that we heard earlier from Catherine, that this is not just about access to education. It's also, if you're in education, but you've got that uncertainty and instability in the home environment, there's going to be a potential impact there as well. So this is not just the children's aspect of uncertainty. Lisa Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to build on some of the points that have been raised by previous speakers, starting with, of course, what has been mentioned by, I think, everyone, the need to facilitate access to schools. We know how important it is for children to be in schools. We've all just lived through a time as a result of COVID where most children were at home. Schools were closed to the majority of students. And we are seeing the impact that these school closures have had on students' mental health and well-being, as well as their academic achievement. So that's only one example that shows us just how important it is for students to be in school, to be surrounded by their peers, to be supported by teachers. And it just illustrates how important schools are and what important role they play in supporting students, both academically, but also supporting their mental health and their well-being. So I think that's just important to remember, and we simply must do better in providing children with access to education as soon as possible, and to avoid disruption of this access as well, because anecdotally, when speaking to schools, it can also happen that students receive access and they do receive a place in school, and then families are being displaced, they're being moved to a different region, and so children have to reintegrate into a new school, which is always a challenge given just how disrupted their access to schooling, to education has been. Which differs, of course, largely according to the regions they've come from when they've joined the country, and so on, which leads me to one of the points that Kimberly has raised about the heterogeneity of the group. I think that's something that we have to be aware of, and that refugee and asylum-seeking students have got very different education histories, very different histories and lives before they join schools or they come to the UK. And Catherine and her organisation have got brilliant resources that outline how these education histories might differ, and why the support that they require in school can change. So we can just think of students arriving from Ukraine who've largely been in formal education up until the point where they arrive in the UK, or compared to other asylum-seeking and refugee students who maybe have had education careers that have been disrupted for far longer. And that will, as a result of that, impact the support that they will require. And that's a similar issue that we already know from EAL, actually, from research on EAL. We know that a label such as EAL is important on the one hand, because it helps us to support students and identify students as potentially requiring additional support, but it doesn't help us at all in describing and capturing the heterogeneity that it covers, because students with EAL, they may be born in the country and just speaking another language at home, or they may be recent arrivals in the country, which of course will impact the support that they require. And I think given just how important EAL provision is for refugee and asylum seeking students, I wonder whether we could envision EAL training at a similar level to SENCO qualifications. At the moment, EAL coordinators in schools are doing brilliant jobs up and down the country. Ruth mentioned Jo McIntyre being in the audience, and her book, for example, outlines brilliantly just how important EAL departments in schools are, and the amazing jobs that they are doing in supporting refugee and asylum seeking students. But again, the support that EAL and coordinators have access to differs vastly. There are brilliant organisations such as NALDIC, for example, who provide great training, but there is currently no national training at a similar level, or national qualification similarly to SENCO. And I wonder whether that could be a way of of supporting these individuals who are supporting refugee and asylum seeking students in schools, which is not to say that it's an individual who can do all of that work. It's very much a school effort, and that's why the training that we've developed that Catherine and Joanna supported us with very kindly, and that I will talk about in the second half a bit more, focuses very much on creating a culture of inclusion in schools. It really needs to be a school effort. And finally, I think it's also worth mentioning, and it's something that at the Chartered College we've first drawn attention to in May 2020 when we looked at the research literature on school closures and the potential impact that different crises can have on students and teachers. So as Ruth mentioned and Catherine mentioned in her presentation as well, of course, there is a lack of training, especially when it comes to mental health and well-being, which can then, as a result, negatively affect teachers' own mental health and well-being, something that's been described in the literature as secondary traumatic stress, because unlike social workers or psychologists who are trained at supporting students, young people with different mental health issues, and thus also trained in coping mechanisms, not to take away, of course, from the stress that they are going through, and many are indeed still affected by secondary traumatic stress. But teachers are not. Teachers are not receiving generally this sort of training, which can in turn negatively affect their mental health and well-being and their ability to support their students further. So therefore, I would, in summary, say absolutely reiterating what others have said before, facilitating access, ensuring that education is not further disrupted, that students are not being moved around, that they can stay in the school where they are starting to make friends, they're starting to make connections. Developing a national EAL qualification at the same level of SENCOs that includes a strong focus on refugee and asylum seeking students and understanding the heterogeneity of students' needs when it comes to language and academic development, and providing mental health training and, of course, support and better connections with organisations that specialise in supporting refugee and asylum seeking students.
Lisa Maria, that was great, and again covered a lot of territory in a short period of time, so thank you very much for that. We look forward to hearing your comments on the next section as well, where I'll give you notice that I'm going to come to you first on that bit. Last but not least, before we go to the questions, Catherine, anything else you wanted to add on this section, or on the basis of anything you've heard from the other speakers?
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I don't want to repeat what other people have said, and you've also all heard quite enough of me already. But just a couple of quick points. I think, again, and this is another shout out to Joe McIntyre, but we're also running a policy, a project that is kind of specifically focused on this question of how we can take steps towards the change policy narrative in refugee education, called the Strive project, that's in partnership with Nottingham University. And the kind of one of the underlying tenets of that just reinforces something that's been shared already, which is that question of how policy changes to immigration intersect with education policies about inclusion, because of course it's no surprise that there is obviously kind of significant dissonance there, and that I think needs to be explored and is a potential avenue where we could get some kind of impact. Linked to that, just to highlight that we've talked about a two-tier system being exacerbated or introduced by the Act, but to emphasise that that is already the case. So when we look at the differences in education access for resettled children and those who are seeking asylum or who have come through an emergency scheme and are in hotel accommodation, and so already we're seeing kind of rapidly or drastically different situations outcomes for children in different scenarios, and particularly those with frequent moves, and particularly those who are older. So in the light of that, and again, another shout out to another organisation, the Bell Foundation, who specialise in English as an additional language. They have recently commissioned us to do some research for them specifically on the situation of older new arrivals and their experiences of accessing education and language acquisition, and that will have policy implications that we're really looking forward to learning about ourselves as we do the research. But that then leads me on to kind of just a second addition, which is this question of integration to mainstream for new arrivals and what policy should be around that. And this is a global issue that all countries who are hosting refugee and asylum seeking children face. And there is huge debate about what that should look like. Most people recognise that children thrive by getting into mainstream education as quickly as possible and not being kept in parallel systems. And yet we live with long waits for school and older children with really limited English, and the impact of that on particularly their high level studies. So this area of what is best practice for orientation and bridging programs as children wait for places, and how that time can be used to accelerate their learning so that they thrive as best as they can when they are in school. We've had a little shout out to Nest already today as one example of that. There are others, and I think that also needs to be built on. And finally, just that I've mentioned, that this is a global issue, that I think there is significant learning in terms of the policy development that's taken place in other countries that host significantly greater numbers of refugee and asylum seeking children than we do in the UK. And looking at some of the innovation that's taken place in the policy context in other countries is also quite a useful next step.
Great, thank you very much for that, Catherine. A few questions that we've got coming in that I might put to the panel now. One from Molly. How much do the panel think that the long waits for school places are a result of a lack of school places generally? Is that an issue? And if so, what can be done? Catherine, do you want to, I don't know who wants to take this, but Catherine, do you want to start off on that?
Sorry, I think my internet briefly cut out, and I heard the first half of the question and not the second. Would you just mind repeating it, Irid? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. It was, how much do the panel think that long waits for school places are a result of a general lack of school places? And if so, can anything be done?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that does play into it, and we are seeing schools under immense pressure at the moment, and we are regularly contacted by head teachers who are saying, I've been asked to enroll X number of children. I'd like to, but I'm not quite sure practically how to make that work, and then that often leads to waits. I think there are other kind of specific factors at play though, that aren't necessarily just to do with general lack of school places. And I think I mentioned one of those earlier, but I didn't really go into the detail of it. But this fear of admitting children, particularly at sort of higher levels in the secondary process, but we are starting to see it impact decisions at the kind of lower levels, even primary as well, of the impact on results profiles for schools is a really significant thing at play. And it's a really kind of sad and unfortunate, because we know that it doesn't have to be the case. And there's some really interesting work that is being done, not only around some of those provisions that allow certain learners to not have their results featured in the school's profile. So for example, those who have been in the country for less than 2 years before their GCSEs, coming from a country that doesn't have English as a mother tongue, but also on how schools can better assess and be given recognition for how they move students from the point at which they start to the point at which they finish. And so the distance travelled as a means of assessment rather than just the final outcome as a means of assessment. So I think the more that can be done around that, the better, in terms of encouraging schools that they don't need to be afraid of accepting children with limited English or gaps in their education previously. And then the second factor, and this will be my last one, the second factor that we've seen at play is just the increasing number of academies in the system at the moment. And just to be really clear, we see brilliant good practice from a lot of academies, both individual academies and multi-academy trusts as a whole, and there's a lot of innovation going on there that is fantastic. One challenge is that the local authority can't direct an academy to accept a child, and so we've worked with some local authorities where they've said, but all of the schools around us are now academies, so we don't have that leverage with anybody. So whereas previously we've been able to say, look, this is, for example, a looked after asylum seeking child, and we can direct the school to accept them, we can't do that now without going, you know, through a much more convoluted route to the Education Secretary. So it's that's an additional thing that we're hearing from some schools. So yeah, two initial thoughts.
That's a really interesting point, maybe some unfinished business there. We've had another question to Kimberly, but did anyone else want to say anything about the supply of school places issue? If not,
I mean,
yes, Ruth.
I honestly don't know the answer, but I mean, I do wonder whether some schools maybe perhaps hide behind that as a reason for not giving places. And I was very struck by what you said, I think it was Catherine, about the head teacher who said that taking in my refugee asylum seeking children was one of the best things he's ever done, and how what they give to the school in terms of aspiration and kind of ultimately academic achievement and everything. And I just think that if more could be said about that, if that kind of message could be got round to schools, then they might be less frightened about taking in these people. I mean, I take the point about assessment, it doesn't help, but yeah, I just think the more that positive messages get around, the better it will be in terms of schools being more open and more willing to try and find ways, you know, even if they are a bit sort of squeezed.
Thank you, Ruth. That's a useful point. We've also got a question which I think is for Kimberly, and she may even be typing an answer. So I don't want to cut across her line of thought, but Kimberly, you've seen the question which says, following on from some of the points you made, do you have advice for delivery organisations on how to be inclusive for refugee and asylum seekers in their programmes and engagement, and where support exists to help with the costs associated with the school day? Are there any concerns that organisations should have about services or compensation complicating the family's asylum claim or being categorised as income? Apologies if I've interrupted your train of thought, but was there anything you wanted to say on that?
Yeah, no, so I was just typing it, but I don't mind to repeat what I wrote down. I was more saying that we get this question a lot, but I think it's more, it doesn't impact the family's asylum support if you are providing them small amounts of money. So it's not on a regular basis. So we've got a hardship fund at We Belong, for example, where young people can access it for essential needs that they might not be getting in school. And we've had cases, for example, where young people are going into school and they're struggling to maintain good hygiene because they just don't have the adequate materials at home, and they live on a £8 stipend as part of their asylum money from the Home Office every week. And that, you know, has been really devastating for them. So through our hardship fund, by applying for that, we're able to then give them those small pockets of money where they've got that independence to actually make the choice of how to use their money and where they want to use it. And we haven't seen it impact their asylum support, because in cases where it's more restricted, then we can offer things like vouchers. Okay, what would you like to get, and which supermarket voucher would you like? I think it's just thinking beyond money. If you can't provide physical cash, then what other means can you support them? And again, I think it was Catherine, I think you touched on person-centered approaches where it's based on a case-by-case basis. So somebody else might be needing money for food, you'd probably give them supermarket vouchers as opposed to someone who needs money for the clothes. And if you can't give them physical cash, then it's what perhaps vouchers. It's thinking outside of the box, I think, as practitioners. And as part of that as well, part of my answer to the question was, if you're hosting events, thinking about what time you're having those events and like where you're having them, because typically if young people are dotted all across London, they might not have the money to travel there. So having those provisions beforehand. So we also pay for young people's travel before they come to our events, just to alleviate that burden. Because I think when you're facing immigration issues, it's so easy to feel isolated and to feel marginalized because you're not being given the room to be a full citizen and actively contribute and engage with other people. So it's as organizations, what can we do to alleviate some of those like logistic issues?
Okay, that's really useful, Kimberly. A couple of other questions. One from Bren Taylor. Great message from Ruth on the positive impact on schools when taking in the young people we're discussing here. Are there any case studies that exemplify this that are being publicised to chivvy up the schools who might be a bit more reluctant? Anybody know of anything that's been done formally or informally on this? Lisa Maria, you were nodding a bit, is that?
Yes, absolutely. I think Catherine can definitely chip in. You provide plenty of such examples, and there are plenty in Joanna's book as well, where this is illustrated beautifully how refugee and asylum seeking students can be integrated in schools and the positive impact it has on them, it has on the wider school community. We have also got a few such case studies in our online course for school leaders on leading refugee education in schools. So the repertoire is growing, but I think we definitely haven't described all of them. We haven't seen all of them. I think there is amazing practice going on in schools up and down the country. So it'd be fantastic to have the resources to showcase this practice more and provide some tangible examples, because I think that's very often the feedback that we get from teachers and school leaders, that what they want, what they need is some guidance and some tangible examples of how you can actually put it in practice, how you can ensure that refugee and asylum seeking students feel welcome and are supported both academically and in terms of their well-being.
That's great. We've got two other questions I want to come to now, and then we will go to the second panel discussion. As I anticipated, the first discussion always tends to be longer than the second. But an interesting question, I don't know whether anyone knows of this, from Ruth Smith, that she said she'd read about the system in France for Ukrainian school children, where they have essentially separate lessons apart from PE for 1 or 2 years. Is this successful, and how does it sit with Catherine's earlier comments that parallel systems are not necessarily best practice? It seems quite a long way away from what we're doing in England. I don't know whether we've got any experts here on the French system of integration, possibly not, but we might have people that want to make more general comments about parallel tracks versus this sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm happy to have the first go. So my understanding is that at least in the first, at the start of the war in Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees arriving in France, in Paris in particular, a system was set up where Ukrainian students were given access to sort of a separate school where they could continue the Ukrainian curriculum with Ukrainian teachers, because the understanding or the assumption was that they would be able to go back to Ukraine relatively quickly. So the underlying assumption was that they were not to be integrated into the French system, as that would just disrupt their education more so than if they just continued with their Ukrainian curriculum. Of course, we've only just only a few days ago we have all gone through the memorizing and remembering that it's been a year, so it's been ongoing, and we know that there is probably no end, unfortunately, in sight of the war in Ukraine. So the question is how things are going to continue. So to put it at a more general level, we know from other contexts as well, obviously Catherine spoke about parallel tracks. We also know it relating to grouping and setting. The evidence is quite strong that actually integrated approaches where students are part of their peer group and are then only given additional support where it's needed, tend to be more effective than approaches where they are separated for the whole curriculum. So whilst, for example, additional English support might well be needed in addition to the usual curriculum, having students within the system and having English or English as an additional language assistance with them that help them to access the curriculum tends to be more favourable for their integration and for their academic developments and their social integration as well.
Okay, that's really helpful. We have got a couple of other questions, but I think we will fold those into the second discussion. So the second discussion is about building a culture of support in schools and across the system. How can we develop in-school policies that build an inclusive culture, share best practice, spread awareness about available resources? Lisa Maria, I'm going to come to you first on this. And I thought we might also fold into this the question that's come in from Shwet K, which is, do you think additional funding available for schools to meet the needs of refugee and asylum seeking children is sufficient? So maybe if panelists want to touch on that at all in their comments as well, they can do. So I'll go to Lisa Maria, and then Ruth, and then Kimberly, and then Catherine.
Thank you. So I would argue that the first step is to recognise the need to create a whole school culture of inclusion, and to recognise that supporting refugee and asylum seeking students can't be the sole responsibility of an individual teacher or school leader, but that it requires joint action. And of course, there will be individuals with specialist training, and in many cases, those are, for example, EAL specialists who will likely take on a leading role, but inclusion needs to happen at all levels. And so it's important to recognise that great practice is already happening, as we said, obviously numerous times today already, in many schools across the country, and we should really make more of that and share it more widely, because the teacher expertise that has developed over the years in this area is just fantastic, and we should be sharing that more widely. And finally, I think it's important to guide teachers and school leaders to reflect on their own context to ensure that learning is as relevant as it can be from any training that we're providing. Because of course, as we said, refugee and asylum seeking students, despite the fact that we use this umbrella term, it's a very heterogeneous group. Schools are very different, contexts are very different, and the groups of refugee and asylum seeking students that schools might take in might differ vastly, and so the support that they require will do so as well. So in our recently launched online course on refugee education for school leaders, we have looked at provision for refugee and asylum seeking students through the framework of safety, belonging and success that has been mentioned before, and that was developed by Professor Joe McIntyre and Fran Abrams in their book on refugee education. And in each section of the course, we've combined research with best practice evidence from different education settings to provide school leaders with those really important tangible examples of how different ideas can be put in place. And the whole purpose of the course is sort of to provide also a place that brings together the resources, different resources that are developed in these amazing organisations such as Refugee Education UK, the book, but also, as Catherine kindly reminded me of, the Bell Foundation, of course, who provides amazing support for EAL students and a range of webinars, as well as NALDIC and so on. And I really think that the framework of safety, belonging and success is really helpful, as it supports teachers and school leaders to consider the inclusion of refugee and asylum seeking students at all levels, legally, academically and socially. And we encourage school leaders in this course to reflect on these three aspects of safety, belonging and success by looking at the legal frameworks and obligations, and how to create an inclusive school culture, the importance of including the whole school community and raising awareness about the heterogeneity that we mentioned numerous times. And also when it comes to success, balancing the importance of high expectations that we know are so important and have such a big impact on students' achievement, and at the same time having and developing an potentially adapted definition of success that can prepare students to become lifelong learners if they arrive late in the country. And for example, FE colleges are doing amazing work in that respect. And then finally, school leaders are guided to complete a school action plan based on their learning, which allows them to contextualize the information, put it in action in their school. So really bringing it all back together into concrete actions and supporting the planning of and developments of an inclusive school culture.
Lisa Maria, that's great. Thank you very much. Looking at the time, we probably won't have a lot of time for questions and comments after the speakers. So if I could just ask speakers to keep an eye on the questions coming in and see if they can pick some of those up in their answers. Joe, I'll ask you to do the one, obviously, about whether EPI is planning any further work in this area and whether it's possible to consider the impact of the length of time spent on asylum support on children's education. We've also had an interesting one from Declan Flanagan. I feel that there's a stark absence of EAL training within ITE provision. From a Northern Ireland perspective, it's not viewed as a subject and therefore not assessed, inspected by Ofsted. Not all of you will be experts in all of the questions coming in, but if you could keep an eye out on them and sort of pick up the ones that are in your area of expertise, that will help us with time. Ruth, over to you.
Well, I'll be very quick because I'm not an expert in any of the areas that the questions are coming in. I mean, just two things. I mean, I think Lisa covered the ground very well. I just wonder whether more could be done to kind of create some kind of online central hub where people can go to for examples, case studies, etc. And more could be done. The point I made at the very beginning to integrate the work that charities like Catherine's do. And I don't know the Bell Foundation, but with the sort of refugee organisations who don't seem to talk very much about education at all, but are in contact with a lot of asylum seekers and refugees. But then my other point I want to make is, can we involve children themselves more? I mean, the more that children can act as mentors for those coming in, work both children who were born here, but also, you know, perhaps older asylum seeking children can support younger ones, and involving children themselves more. It relates a bit to what Kingsley said about the citizenship of all those involved, and so it's not like then, you know, different groups. But I think that would help to integrate and create a more inclusive culture if you've involved the children in the development of that. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ruth. That's really useful. Kimberly.
Thank you, Lisa and Ruth. I think your points were really kind of building on what I'm going to speak about. And I think the main thing is, I feel like young people need to be given that that capacity, that autonomy, like you were saying, Ruth, because a lot of the times we find that even at We Belong, when guardians or even teachers come to us explaining situations that students are facing, it's that the adult takes control of the situation. They want to know more about the immigration status and what can be done. And the way in which we're trying to change this approach We Belong, and we've really championed for this, is that the young person has to take hold of their own status, because at some point where they go into being an adult, they will be placed with this immigration status and not be well equipped to, one, understand what it means, but to understand then what pathways that they can take. And that can be really difficult. And I've had a case recently of a young person that came to the UK when they were 3, and they went through the school system and also the care system. And it's not until now, where the young person has recently just turned 18, they were left alone with their status and the implications of that, because it's not regularized and they are miles off at the moment from even getting British citizenship. And that's why I think early intervention is really key. So when it comes to us as practitioners, but also even in doing trainings with teaching staff. And I think, Lisa, you touched on this, that it shouldn't just be the role of the teaching staff that are the leads, it should be everybody's responsibility, because then they can pass on that information widely to the students. But I think a combination of information, raising awareness sessions with students, even as young as 13, because We Belong prior to this was supporting ages 16 to 25. And we realized that actually 16, they're thinking about, college, maybe apprenticeships, maybe university. We need to dial it back and even reach out to children who are much younger than this. And it's not a case of overwhelming them with information, but even getting them to understand their status from the beginning. So the early intervention is really important. I think also when it comes to spreading awareness, there are different law centres that are offering pro bono support. Many of the people that come to us, especially families, don't always know where to go, and sometimes they can be open to exploitation from people that are giving them wrongful immigration advice. And so it's key that we are able to signpost people to free legal clinics, for example, if there are any. We've recently got an immigration caseworker that supports young people with cases, and we've seen the benefits of that and how much that has really supported not only the young person but the whole family as a unit, because then they're able to receive more information. I do think also with what Ruth mentioned is that there needs to be a space online, if possible, where these resources can be shared amongst practitioners. So in higher education, there's a thing called a JISC mail, where education practitioners share information. If somebody's got a question, best practice, everything is on there. And it's such a useful tool because it keeps you informed and you can ask the questions. I think something is needed of that sort for the younger students as well. And it could be something that could be done for teachers nationwide. Because I think then it then alleviates the stresses of us as well as organizations to be the only ones that are trying to push this information out. I think lastly, when it comes to best practice, I would say schools and even universities to an extent understanding what their approaches are in terms of what can they actually do, because sometimes there's a lot of compliance involved with young people in cases, and just thinking about, okay, what can we actually do, but what can we do to have more humane approaches to supporting young people, and ensuring that that kind of support is administered in a compassionate way. Because when I've heard of cases where students haven't been able to get free school meals because of their immigration status, and you think, but that food's going to go away, what can education institutions do beyond their traditional role to provide that support? And then lastly, I just wanted to make a point on, I think when it comes to widening our thinking about these issues, because right now it's a lot about this is how the act's impacting young people and children from refugee and migrant backgrounds right now, but we need to think about long term. And in thinking about influencing policy, can we map out the different areas, the different pain points in which young people are experiencing problems later? Because then that will help us figure out what are the provisions that are needed now, as well as along the line. Because somebody mentioned that there's queues of up to 9 months where young people aren't getting places onto schools to even start school as refugees and asylum seekers. That can impact student finance applications later on, because they'll be looking at, okay, so why did you have a gap between this time of arriving and actually starting school? And because young people don't have jobs at that time, they don't have any tangible proof to show where they were, student finance might see that as a gap in status. You don't have evidence to prove your eligibility. So just thinking about what are the long-term impacts as well.
Kimberly, that was great. Lots of really good ideas there. Catherine, I'm going to come to you. I don't know whether you're able to pick up the question that's come in about two-tier systems becoming normalized. I also wanted to ask you, if I might, about one of the things that you mentioned in your address, where you were talking about the wait for places while the assessment process takes place. Do we have any data on how much of that wait is essentially pointless because the individuals concerned end up in the education system anyway, they're just out of it for a long period of time, versus those who are actually filtered out by the process that's in place? Is any data collected on that, or is there any impression of what that might look like? And then anything else you wanted to cover in this final wrap up before I come to Joe?
Yeah, thank you. That is such a great question. In terms of specific data on that, I haven't seen any statistics on that myself. That's not to say that they don't exist, but I certainly haven't been aware of that concrete data being collected. What I can say in terms of what we see from the kind of large numbers of children and schools that we have worked with through some of that process is that the vast majority end up in education. It's just that they arrive mid-year and they have to wait till September, or they get moved from one emergency accommodation to another and have to restart the process of applying. And so my sort of informal assessment would be that the vast majority of the wait is exactly as you phrased it, pointless. So yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you I just wanted to say thank you to Kimberly as well for the point about early intervention, which I think we probably haven't emphasized enough, and that's really really critical. So to pick up on some of the things that came through the questions in the chat and some of the comments so far, a couple of things that I would say in regard to the sort of the clear appetite for good practice resources and case studies and things. A couple of things. I can see my colleague Emily has put some links to some of those resources that are on our website in the chat. So thanks, Emily, for doing that. I also wanted to just very briefly mention the brilliant work of Schools of Sanctuary and the work that they do supporting schools to provide a culture of welcome for refugee and asylum seeking children. And they also have many really fantastic and helpful resources on their website. So I think haven't actually scanned through the list of participants, but so I don't know if there's anyone from School of Sanctuary here, but if there is, and if not, maybe Emily, you could put their website also into the chat. Because there's yeah, it would be a shame for people not to have sight of those resources. And then thirdly, we're working on a project with a number of partners at the moment that is looking at specifically promising practices in refugee education across Europe and other high income contexts. And that's recognizing that there have been some quite large scale projects on promising practices in refugee education in lower income contexts, but not so much, as has kind of been evident by the comments today, not so much in higher income contexts like the UK. And so we are sort of analysing all of the practices that have come in from across a whole range of countries at the moment, and we'll be doing a kind of series of events and outputs from that around the case studies and the both the case studies themselves and the kind of threads of learning that come through that. So we can liaise with EPI maybe to share information about that when it's available. Then the second thread that seems to have come through in some of the comments that we haven't addressed yet is specifically this question of initial teacher education, and there's been a few comments about that being also increasingly squeezed. And so again, knowing that we've got Joanna McIntyre, who developed the kind of safety, belonging, success framework in the audience, as Lisa Maria has already mentioned. We've been working with her specifically in this area of initial teacher education, and we've developed a 6-session completely online asynchronous initial training resource for teachers that we'll be piloting with a number of initial teacher education providers, but that is equally usable and accessible for teachers who are already in practice in the classroom and have been for several years. And that is based on a combination of Joe's framework and on 6 pillars of a ladder of engagement that we've developed for schools that looks at wherever you are in this journey, whether it's the first time that you are enrolling a child from a forced migration background, or like the head teacher that I mentioned earlier, you have enrolled 70+ students and are like living in the benefit of that. Still, schools are asking the question at whatever level, what is the next thing that I could do that would both enable children to thrive and enable them to get better outcomes? And so the pillars of this ladder of engagement look at access to education, well-being in education, English language acquisition, subject-specific learning, so looking at some of these questions around accelerated learning and like adaptations to the curriculum, and various other things. I, for the sake of time, won't go through it all in detail. But there is a training session on each of those things. So it's 6 hours of kind of core content. And again, it's going to be freely available. We just want as many people to be able to benefit from it as possible. So we can share more about that when it's online as well. And we're hoping that it won't be restricted just to the sort of partner providers that we're working with. Finally, we've also got, one of my colleagues just reminded me, we've also got some webinars around a trauma-informed welcome for refugees that particularly has an education lens as well coming up. So if anyone wants to pick up on some of the particular trauma things that have been rightly emphasised today, then that's also on our website. And I think finally, in terms of this question of support for schools, I would link back to the question that came up earlier, and I think I can see us come up again in another question in the thread around parallel provision. And because I think that's not only a policy question, it's also a question of practically day in, day out, what does that mean for schools? I think we see a really clear global pattern, which is that countries often end up starting with parallel provision and separating out children, and then and that's often because a rationale exists that, particularly with large-scale crises like Afghanistan or Ukraine, where there are large numbers of children arriving from one particular country in a limited time frame, people start off thinking, well, it's not going to last for very long, and so the best case scenario is that children are able to continue learning with their own curriculum in their own language of instruction, and then they'll be able to go back and learn in their country of origin. What's played out time and time again, sadly, over the course of the last 20 years, is that doesn't turn out to be the case, and that the stay in the host country ends up being longer than any of the refugees would have hoped for. And so we see that pattern of parallel systems being set up, and then people saying, actually, we need to be going towards integration to mainstream as quickly as possible. And so then what that means in terms of supporting schools is that we really need to be asking the question of when that parallel provision does exist, because there is perhaps, and this is the case in the UK, there is a period when children unfortunately are either out of school because of a wait, or they need more support than is able to be provided in the school environment to get them up to speed as rapidly as possible with some of the language requirements. How can those bridging and orientation programs be designed and delivered in such a way that they are kind of supportive resources for schools, and that communication between that provision, which I don't really want to call parallel provision, but more bridging provision, is done in such a way that when the children move as quickly as possible into the mainstream, that actually benefits the school, because there's been clear communication between the people who are running the bridging program and who are then integrating those children into mainstream classes. And I think that is something that is really underexplored in this country. And yet there are these programs operating all around the country in different guises, and so that probably would benefit from a closer examination as well.
Catherine, that was great. Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to hand over to Jo for final reflections and anything she wants to say about EPI's future programme in this area. I'm going to try then to wrap us up at 28 minutes past, so that those of you who are on other Zoom calls have got 2 minutes of sanity time before you go on your next online event. Jo, over to you.
Thank you, David. Well, what a privilege to try and sum up such a rich and really useful discussion about this topic. I think it's clear that one of the things we need to take away from this discussion is that the quality of policy for immigration, where we're seeing problems with young people with precarious status living in hotels, issues of destitution and family separation, that quality of immigration policy is impacting in many, many ways on the education world, education providers, and how we're going to achieve better outcomes for refugee and asylum seeking young children in schools and in education. So we have that challenge. It's created these policy challenges. It's clear that it's a very complex subject and that this group of young people has very heterogeneous needs. And we can see clearly that there are data and knowledge gaps also around this subject, that it's not well understood and grappled with in the same way that some other educationally disadvantaged groups are. It's also been clear from the conversation that there's a bit of an absence of expertise and roles, training, the kind of workforce that we need in order to deliver the best outcomes for this group of children and young people. So I thought Lisa Maria said something really powerful, which was that we should really be having, she was suggesting, the same concern for the education recovery of refugee and asylum seeking children as we do for all children in pandemic recovery, which has been a massive topic of conversation and effort in England over the last few years. So that leads us on to thinking about what are the solutions to these policy challenges. And I think there's definitely been some powerful suggestions around things like having those professional roles, having an EAL co, for an example, perhaps better rollout nationally of the mental health support teams in schools that are partnering the NHS with schools to support children and young people's mental health and well-being, and with a particular focus on children who've experienced trauma. So there are clear opportunities there to develop better policy than we currently have at the moment. And there's also been a couple of issues where they are problems not just for this group, but actually for quite a few disadvantaged groups in education. So questions around school admissions and the influence of school results profiles on everything that happens in the education system go wider than this group, but obviously include this group. So I think it may be important to try and join forces and think about how we could have better systems alongside those working on the similar problems for different groups of children, such as those with special educational needs and disabilities. I thought the framework that's been described of safety, belonging and success as a model for practice just sounded wonderful, and it made me wonder why we don't think that's a great framework actually for all children in education, because children have many different kinds of needs, and it always strikes me when we're working on groups that have educational challenges that quite a lot of what they need is what all children need. And I wondered if we could add celebration to that after the success as well, because there's clearly a kind of PR or communication issue that we've got to grapple with here around the opportunities to help young people succeed, and to then be in a position whereby nobody thinks of taking those children into their schools as something that they might want to potentially avoid. I'll stop there.
Joe, thank you very much indeed. We will be producing an EPI report that summarises the two events that we've held to date, that will try to capture some of the issues that people have raised and also the points that the panellists have made. But I'd like to thank the Paul Hamlyn Foundation for enabling the two events. I'd like to thank all of those who have attended today and raised points or questions. But my particular thanks, of course, to the 5 excellent panelists we've had today, to Kimberly, Catherine, Ruth, Lisa Maria, and our own Joe Hutchinson. They've all had great contributions, but they've also made my job very easy by being extremely concise and pithy, which is not always the case on these occasions, but this has been a bit of an exemplar one. So we found it extremely useful, and it will give us a lot to reflect on as we think about developing our own programme of research going forward. So thank you all very much for attending today, particularly the 5 panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.